But remember, fascists, you don't argue with fascists. You punch a fascist in the face. You confront a fascist in the street. We don't have this ideological brainwashing to that extent that you have in the West. You had the SPD, who killed Rosa Luxemburg at the end of the day, who killed Liebknecht. It was the reformist left. What Sisi did after 2013 is that he completely smashed the civil society, completely smashed it. The Muslim Brotherhood in specific is like the Islamic version of the Christian Democrats that you have here in Germany.
I actually remember a documentary about a guy doing a bike journey from South Africa to Europe, and he was, of course, arrested in Egypt.
Yeah, of course. Who's this, guy on a bike and who's taking photos and videos around, the first instantaneous reaction is arrest him.
And how is it for you? There's no chance to go back?
I'm wanted.
Islam is not compatible with democracy, they cannot be changed, and we see it. Even now in Tunisia, I think every revolution failed, in Iran as well.
I think this is a racist and colonialist point of view.
Lange Rede.
Transzendentale, metaphysische Wesen.
Etwas Tonic Water, am besten noch Zitrone.
Unsichtbar.
Eine Gurke, ganz wichtig.
Spirituell, mystisch.
Am Ende kalt genießen.
Kurzer Sinn.
Lange Rede.
Kurzer Gin. Hey Hannes, what's up?
Yeah, I'm okay. Jan's a little bit sick, but the rest is fine, thank you. What about you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Listen, do you remember when we attended this strange conference last year?
You mean that left radical one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I learned some stuff, but sometimes I was really afraid of their kind of radical ideas.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, me too. But listen, on their schedule, they had some... Or I saw one topic about Egypt from this Hossam guy. Do you remember him?
Not quite, but go on.
Well, I thought about writing about Egypt. Haven't you been recently there?
Yeah, I was, but it was just like one of these all-inclusive trips, Egypt, I heard, is kind of dangerous,
Oh, really? Okay, I see. But didn't they start that revolution and caused other revolutions to start?
No. As far as I remember, that was Tunisia.
Okay.
You sure you want to write about Egypt if you don't know anything about history?
Come on, I mean, I watched some YouTube videos and then, I guess that's what most of the journalists do as well, right?
Well, okay, if you say so. But it seems like you have some catching up to do. I think you should really speak with this Hossam guy then.
Yeah, okay. But will you join me when I meet him? I might probably feel a bit more confident with an actual expert on my side.
Yeah, why not? Of course. When shall we do it?
Tomorrow?
Okay.
I'll ask him.
Great.
Alright, I'm kind of nervous. I mean, I have a lot of knowledge on political science, but Egypt, I don't know.
Hey, Jannis, you got this. With our liberal mindset, we are kinda like universally able to explain the world, huh?
True. Great to meet you, Mr. el-Hamalawy, or can I just call you Hossam?
Yes, please do.
Thank
Hello,
you.
Jannis.
I'm Jannis, and this is my friend, Hannes.
Hi, I'm Hannes.
Hi, Hannes.
Yeah, he told me about you, your work, and that you were involved in the Egyptian revolution. Before we start talking about this huge topic, could you give us an introduction about yourself?
Sure. My name is Hossam el-Hamalawy. I'm an Egyptian journalist and also a socialist activist. I was born and lived most of my life in Cairo, Egypt, where I was involved in the labor movement. I had the honor of taking part as an organizer in the 2011 uprising. I remained in Egypt till the year 2015, but then I had to leave the country because of the coup that happened in 2013 and the ensuing crackdowns. Right now, I'm based here in Berlin, where I'm doing my PhD on the Egyptian security services. And I'm almost done. I will defend my dissertation hopefully next month.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Yannis came up with this idea to write his thesis about the revolutionary Egypt in the Arab Spring. I mean, we study political science, or POVI as we call it in Germany. But from what I've read, you cannot really call it a revolution, right? What happened? Because it didn't succeed in Egypt.
I do call it a revolution for sure. There is no doubt about it. A revolution, people define it by different means, but for me, the definition of a revolution, it's a mass rising from below with the aim of changing the regime. But in my point of view, that the revolution got defeated, and a defeated revolution does not negate the fact that it was a revolution in the first place. Here in Germany, for example, you had a glorious event in 1918. You had the German Revolution, but it got catastrophically defeated. This does not mean that we would negate the fact that it was a revolution that had a potential of changing the German society and actually the whole world if it had succeeded.
So, are there even any aspects of it where it succeeded? Because I think it's hard to imagine because there are so many people killed and so many bad things happening, but still, were there some good things about it?
Of course, there were good things about it, and a defeated revolution does not mean that we should denounce it or think it was a bad idea to do it in the first place. But let's be clear. First, a revolution breaks out not because there is Hossam who's calling for it, or Yannis is calling for it, or Hannes is calling for it. A revolution, by essence, it's a spontaneous event on behalf of the population. The population does it. Now, revolutionaries like myself and you and Hannes would have a role to play in these events. And it is our intervention that could lead it to success or defeat. So did the revolution have an impact? Of course it had an impact. We saw glimpses of what a future society could be like that's different from the one that we had living under. And although it got defeated and slaughtered from 2013 onwards, but it left some impact in some of the spheres of the lives of Egyptians. I would say that when it comes to, for example, gender issues, the counter-revolution did not completely destroy this movement. So we saw actually the rise of feminist activists who continue to be active up until today, even with the squashing of the revolution. But in other spheres of life, everything became worse. And that's what a defeated revolution looks like. And again, if I was going to cite the example of Germany, a defeated revolution meant Nazism. And definitely Nazism was worse than anything that Germans had lived under previously. So a counter-revolution does not bring back society to what it was in day one of the revolution. Actually, it creates a completely different society with much more level of repression.
But when you bring the German example, one could really argue it would have been better to not even have started a revolution in the first place, because then there would not have been the counter-revolution and later on Nazism. And with all those victims.
I am sure that there are also people in Egypt who regret the fact that there was a revolution in the first place. And, I know some of these people on a personal basis. But again, I will repeat what I've just said a few minutes ago. Like, it's not up to me and you to have a revolution or not. It's not like, we got on some conspiracy in a closed room and we said, okay, let's have a revolution tomorrow, guys. And then we can look back and say, oh, it was a mistake that we took that decision. Well, whether we think it was a good decision or not, it would have happened.
Yeah. But you still need people to organize and act in the end.
Exactly, and this is not necessarily what would spark it, but it is what would sustain it. So if Hossam wasn't there, the 25th of January 2011 would have happened. But Hossam and his comrades would then play a role in trying to push this revolution forward. In the same way that there would be others who would be doing their best to try to strangle it, contain it, diffuse it. And if I was going to cite the German example once again, you had the SPD. Who killed Rosa Luxemburg at the end of the day? Who killed Liebknecht? It was the reformist left.
Die Sozialdemokraten.
Okay, but I still don't understand. So what was the main trigger point or grievances in Egypt to start the revolution? Was it the craving for democracy?
The trigger for a revolution differs definitely from one country to the other. In the case of Tunisia, for example, we know about Bouazizi, the street vendor whose cart was being confiscated by the police, and he decided to set himself on fire as a protest. This is what triggered the Tunisian revolution. In Egypt, usually people are quick to point to Khalid Said, who was a young middle-class Alexandrian guy who was brutally tortured by the police and killed in the summer of 2010. And this triggered anti-torture protests, and he later became the icon for the revolution. But I think it would be a little bit mistaken to just start the scope or the timeline from 2010, because usually a revolution, when it happens in any country, no matter what the trigger is, it is the climax of a long process that precedes it, where dissent is accumulating, where anger is accumulating, where people are getting into small struggles here and there and accumulating experience on how to organize and to confront the state. And usually when the trigger comes, it all of this formula just explodes into an uprising. So what triggered the revolution? I would say it's police torture. But let's look at the main slogan that was raised by the revolutionaries in Tahrir. It was bread, freedom, and social justice. عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية. عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية. عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية. عيش حرية. Bread is a major component of the Egyptian family food basket. It's very carbohydrates heavy, and this actually a sign for poverty other than like dietary choices. So people were calling for bread, people were calling for freedom from the oppression that we were living under thanks to the Mubarak's dictatorship, and social justice, equality between the masses.
So really the basic needs, actually. And what role did you play in all of those years before 2010, 2011?
I would say that 2011 was the result of a process which started in the year 2000, almost 10 years before it, or a decade before it. I mean, I was born in 1977, so I joined university as an undergraduate. I was a freshman in 1995 when I joined university. And Egypt at the time was very different from the Egypt of 2011. We had our first war on terror. which was declared by Hosni Mubarak in the beginning of the 1990s. And this war on terror had the declared aim of defeating the Islamist insurgency, but like all wars on terror, virtually everywhere, it is a war on dissent, obviously. And it leads to the militarization of the police, the militarization of the state. It leads to a militarized response to any sort of opposition that exists. And usually civil liberties are stifled in every field, not just for the Islamists. So at the time, there was the industrial or the labor movement was completely smashed. The neoliberal reforms started in 1991, the same year when the war on terror was declared. And this is something that we always have to keep in mind. Usually neoliberal reforms go hand in hand with those declared wars on crime, wars on terror, war on drugs, because again, it leads to militarization and containing any sort of social dissent that would explode because of neoliberalism. So in the 1990s, you could not whisper Mubarak's name. You could not whisper it. You could not talk in politics over the phone because all phones were tapped. As student activists, we could mobilize on the campuses, but once we leave the campus, you can get shot by the police. And industrial actions were very rare, but when it happened, it usually used to get smashed by the police special operations forces. You know, these who are dressed in black, masks, would storm factories. And there were cases where at least one worker was killed in those violent suspensions. Now, the year 2000 was a turning point. Why? What happened in the year 2000? It was the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada. And, being here in Germany, I know, of course, that the situation here is horrible when it comes to the Palestine solidarity movement. But in the Arab world, Palestine is always the main radicalizing and revolutionizing factor for Arab youth. So the moment the Intifada broke out and you had Al Jazeera that was beaming the visuals to every Egyptian family house, mass protests were ignited, mainly in the university campuses in the beginning, but soon reached the high school and kindergarten students, which is something that we had not seen in the country probably since the 1919 revolution that we had. You had the professional syndicates. By professional syndicates, I don't mean the blue-collar trade unions. Professional syndicates are those syndicates for the lawyers, the pharmacists, doctors, journalists, and historically they have been hotbed for political activism. So you had all of these mass protests exploding. But here is the thing. The moment people mobilize in solidarity with the Palestinians and against imperialism, it doesn't take long for the regional focus to shift into domestic focus. Because people would start chanting, pro-Palestinian slogans, but then people would start asking, so why isn't our government doing enough to help the Palestinians? Why is our government opening an embassy for the Israelis in the heart of Cairo? Why is our government making all of these derogatory statements against the Palestinians? And then as soon as the central security forces would show up, these are our riot police who are fearful, dressed in black, with sticks and armed, people would start asking, well, why is our government, instead of sending the army to help the Palestinians, for example, they are sending us the troops to quell our peaceful dissent? By the end of the protest, I swear this happened, for example, in one of the protests that I organized in 1999, in solidarity with the Lebanese who were then being bombed by the Israelis. By the end of the protest, people were discussing the bilharzia disease that is affecting the peasants in Upper Egypt. People were discussing the housing situation and why is all of this money being funneled into the rich gated communities outside Cairo And when you think about it, this started by a regional focus, but
Yeah.
by the end we were talking about domestic politics.
So people got more and more political.
Exactly.
In a way.
Exactly.
Okay.
And people can draw parallels.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way that people start thinking the Palestinian children are confronting Israeli tanks, so we can confront Hosni Mubarak's tanks when he sends them to us. So the year 2000 led to the revival of street politics in Egypt. And I, as a socialist activist, I was part of the organizing community at the time. And actually, the first time I was detained and tortured by state security police was in the year 2000 because of my role in these protests.
So you were 23 years old.
Roughly, yeah, around that time. And this was my first detention experience. The protests were quelled by the police due to repression and mass arrests, but then they reignited once again in April 2002. And this was when Ariel Sharon sent his tanks to the cities of the West Bank. And you had, the Jenin massacre and the other infamous massacres which took place. This ignited a new wave of protests. And at the time, this was my first time ever to hear thousands having the courage to chant against Hosni Mubarak. So the main slogan at the time was حسني مبارك زي شارون نفس الشكل ونفس اللون. Hosni Mubarak is just like Sharon. He's the same color, he's the same figure. So as you can see, the wall of fear was collapsing brick by brick. Comes 2003, and that's like the war on Iraq when it ignited.
Another war on terror.
Exactly, but this triggered bigger protests that we had witnessed, much more bigger than those of the year 2000 and the year 2002. And actually, we took over Tahrir Square for 2 days in what became a dress rehearsal for the uprising a decade later. Hosni Mubarak's posters were burned down. The ruling National Democratic Party banners were taken down. Police were confronted heroically. Of course, the state acted amok, and they went in and they arrested hundreds of people and
people weren't scared, and like you, your friends, and everyone, I could imagine to be so fucking scared, like with all this police and you see the state acting.
Of course, people were scared, but then when you think about it, these protests included tens of thousands. The Egyptians are in millions. At the time, we were probably around 70 million or something. I mean, today in 2023, Egypt is 101 million. So it was still a minority of the population, but even this minority, a few years earlier, would not have dared to do it. And across the following years, you would find that this minority was like increasing. And even when we were staging these small protests, now you had the age of satellite telecommunication and satellite TV stations and what have you. So these small protests that we were organizing, the visuals were beamed to a wider population. So even if you were sitting in some province in Egypt in the middle of nowhere and you're against Mubarak, but you think that you're the only crazy one, who's against Mubarak, suddenly you see on TV other crazy people who are also against Mubarak. So you feel that you're not alone. So you get more encouraged to follow suit and join the action. So in this way, dissent has been accumulating till 2010. And then you had the explosion of the revolution.
Yeah.
Okay, but I still don't understand why you even organize if suppression looks this hard. And how does torture even look like in Egypt? I bet it's cruel. And the other question is also then why you think, is it worth it? Can't you just do it in a democratic way with reforms and go into politics directly? What is your take on that?
Like we
Well-
would do it here.
Yeah, well, in the case of Egypt, you didn't really have room for reformist politics at the time. You didn't have clean elections, you didn't have the freedom for assembly, the freedom to form trade unions, the freedom to establish political parties. We lived under emergency law that banned the assembly of more than 5 people together. And it is actually a British colonial law, from the First World War that we have, successive governments have had the liberty, to implement. So we didn't really have the luxury of having reformist politics at the time. Now, whether taking the decision to organize under dictatorship, it's not an easy decision, of course. And once you get involved, then there are consequences. There are consequences when it comes to your own personal safety in terms of detention and torture. And there are consequences also for your family because they go after also our families. But, repression is a double-edged sword. You can repress people and this would scare them for some time, but it can also radicalize others. And in my case, although, I came from a middle-class family, essentially. My father originally came from a railway working-class family who worked in the railways in Tanta, in the Nile Delta. But thanks to the social mobility policies under Nasser in the 1950s and 60s, he managed to become the first among his family to join university and become a university professor later. But the kind of environment I grew up in was definitely more privileged than many other Egyptians. But you cannot escape repression in Egypt, meaning as a middle class kid, you would be on the receiving end of the wrath of the police on occasions. And you see around you misery. I know that some people can be desensitized and they would think that, who gives a shit? And they would have all of these social Darwinist views, if people are poor, then they deserve to be poor. People are sick, they deserve to be sick. If I'm rich and living in a privileged status, it's because I deserve it. But not everyone thinks this way. I'm not one of those people who have a romanticized image about human nature, but at the same time I understand that we as human beings, part of our evolution and our ability to become a dominant race, as a human race, on this planet, was because we decided to cooperate. And we would defend our weak. We would work together in order to build shelter for one another. So cooperation, I believe, is built in our genes. Competition, like cutthroat competition, I think these are the intruding elements that we are not wired to do. It's against our human nature. Yes, I understand we can compete in games, we can compete sports, that's fine. But to cut one another's throat for resources and for power and glory and all of these reasons, I don't believe that this is part of our genetic code.
Yeah, but our economic system is based on competition, basically. The capitalist structure, it's based on competition. So
it is, and that's
and
why
all the wealth also. If you look at Germany and also trade,
definitely. When the colonization of North America started, the scientists, they gave the Sioux Indians an IQ test, and they were shocked to find out that the Native Americans could not understand why should we compete with one another and why can't we help one another with the answers. If you look at how they lived, they did not have private property. Land was communally owned and communally cultivated. So the kind of culture that flourished in such society, it's a culture that stressed cooperation, not competition. So capitalism, at the end of the day, it's a system that really has taken a minority of the history of the human race. As Homo sapiens, we lived on this planet for roughly like 500,000 years. We lived under a class society only this past 10,000 years. That's nothing. That's nothing from 500,000 years. And from this 10,000 years, capitalism is only like the last 400 years that we've been living under. I believe that us as human beings, we can come up with a different system and that we deserve to live under a different system. Here in Germany, you might not have the same level of repression that is out there in the Arab world or in Egypt in specific. But each ruling class in any society, they have their own mechanisms for control. And for a very long time, Germany was just as repressive as any of the countries that you see in the global south. But the democracy or the liberal democracy that you're living under here in Germany, which is, it's not perfect, but definitely there is much more bigger margin for freedoms compared to Egypt and elsewhere, is the result of two things. One, it's because of the heroic struggle of the German people in order to grab this margin of freedom that they can enjoy today. I mean, these were heroic sacrifices. And the other factor is that the German ruling class are established enough and wealthy enough that they could secede reforms if they are pressured. Now, definitely there is some level that they will not, yield behind it. And, according to the forecasts of the economic forecast, Germany will be entering a recession next year. And, you don't know how things will evolve afterwards.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they are still wealthy enough to secede reforms. So this means that they can control the German population with emphasis on ideology more than the emphasis on the bare-knuckle tactics of the police and elsewhere. Here, if you speak to any German, or most Germans, they will tell you that we live under democracy. I elect my rulers. I can be rich if I work hard. I have like a good health service. I have this and that. People believe that they are free. And this is the common sense. And sometimes the job of a revolutionary in the advanced industrial societies, it's much more difficult than us in the Arab world or the global south. Because even with the repression, people know that, the parliament is a joke. People know that the state are a bunch of gangsters, in suits. People know that the police are the biggest cartel. People know that the army, they are mercenaries, like we don't have this ideological brainwashing to that extent that you have in the West.
You speak a lot about classes, but that to me sounds a bit like a very old-fashioned Marxist way. Does it really apply to Germany, for example, nowadays?
I do.
Class society?
Of course. I mean, class applies anywhere at any time because people usually, when we talk about working class, they have this romanticized or like traditional image of like, a blue collar worker, carrying, his machines and tools and covered in grease, just like modern times, Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, or the football clubs in England with the ultra supporters. Yeah.
So, but this is actually wrong conception. For two reasons. One, class is not determined by lifestyle, not determined even by income. Class is determined by your relationship to the means of production. Do you own the means of production or you don't own them? This is number one. Number two, Karl Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, how did they define the working class? It's simple. Those who do not own the means of production, so they have to sell their labor power in exchange for a wage. You're a wage laborer. So this means that if you're a web developer in some IT startup, you don't own the means of production and you sell your labor power, in exchange for a wage. You're a wage laborer. So the working class is still out there. When they tell you we live in a post-industrial society, this is bullshit. I mean, look around you. Everything around you is manufactured. The table we're sitting on, that's manufactured. The mic is manufactured, The ceramics that's being used here, for the floor is manufactured. The wooden cupboard is manufactured. Everything around you is manufactured, literally. We do not produce anything in our homes. Yeah, some people might, plant 2 tomatoes, in their balcony. Some people might feel happy that they have a solarium, where they can plant some cucumbers, but the economy is not based on that.
No.
Everything around you is literally manufactured. So class is not an outdated notion, and the working class is not an outdated notion, in my view.
Yeah, Hannes, we studied political studies and didn't really touch that topic, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Because for political science, there are no classes. You have voters and citizens.
Yeah.
And,
That's what we
everyone
learned.
is equal in front of the law, and the law will treat the owners of Siemens in the same way that they would treat, Yanis and Hannes.
Yeah.
But, of course, that's part of the ideological package that's being sold to you.
Okay, but you also talked a lot about security and the importance of military. I think you once also said that the military is the backbone of a dictatorship, for example. But I'm also a little bit concerned because I thought that the military, for example, in Germany or in any country is important, as you see in the current war, that you need a strong military to protect yourself and to protect maybe or preserve a democracy, which is right now in Germany. Don't you think so too, or?
Which is under attack.
No, I don't think so. Whether it is in a global South dictatorship or in a global North democracy, the forces of repression are the forces of repression at the end of the day, and they are either the security services, the police, the military. Now, this is not feudalism, where the landlord will tell you, these are my mercenaries and you will have to pay or else I will send them to kick your ass. No, these are your fellow Germans who are in uniform and they are out there on the borders protecting you from Putin, from whatever, dangers. You will wake up one day and you'll find them invading the country. And this nationalist discourse is, by the way, it's prevalent in Egypt, it's prevalent in Germany, it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. Maybe here, you don't find, once again, the forces of repression at the forefront. Mm-hmm. Because the ruling classes here, they do not need this micro-policing and this militarized policing on a daily basis. But again, things cannot stay like this forever. Revolutions are not, they always tell you, Marxism believes in historical inevitability and that socialism will win, it will have to win. But this is, once again, this is trash. Rosa Luxemburg, building on Engels, said it's either socialism or barbarism. It's either that, you push your society to develop into socialism or you can descend to barbarism. And we've seen barbarism. We've seen the Nazis, we've seen World War I, World War II. We've seen more than 150 military conflicts erupting during the so-called Cold War, following the collapse of the Soviet Union up until today. It's a jungle. The world has turned into a jungle, and armed conflicts are exploding everywhere. These armies in a class society where there are people who have and people who do not have the wealth, these institutions of the state are not neutral. They will convince you, they will try to convince you that they are neutral, but it's not. Maybe the German ruling elites, they do not need to have the military on the streets every day to guarantee, law and order from their point of view. But this is a scenario that I tell you is not far-fetched to happen one day. It depends on a simple thing, the level of class struggle. At the moment in Germany, the level of class struggle is very low, and it has been low for quite some time.
Yeah. But inflation is going up, so...
Exactly, and you never know how things will evolve in the future. We know revolutions are inevitable because capitalism as a system of booms and busts, it's built in the system, at the end of the day. But the success of these revolutions is not inevitable. It depends, is Yanis and Hannes, organized enough with their comrades so as to take this social movement a step forward, or it will evaporate like boiling water, in the air, in the presence of also reformist parties like the SPD, and the others. So no, the military is definitely the last bastion of repression for the state, and it will continue to play that role. But the military also is not a homogeneous structure, because it's not the sons and daughters of the owners of Siemens and Volkswagen and all of these companies who will actually do the fighting. It's usually impoverished working class Germans who would be at the front lines. Now, they might be bought into the military ideology and they will take part in imperial wars, and they have done that. But it reaches a point when this structure would start to face its own class dynamics. And this is at a time of revolution. Why didn't the Egyptian army open fire on protesters in 2011, in the beginning? It's because all of these conscripts and low-ranking officers who were sent to Tahrir, they were part of the people. They were won over completely by the protesters initially. So it took the army like 3 years of planning so as to be able to conduct this massacre and the counter-revolution that happened later. And by the way, this is not just my analysis. Sometimes the best information about the ruling Egyptian regime would come from its sponsors outside, like the US, for example. So if you go to the US State Department website, under the FOIA section, the Freedom of Information Act, you will find the declassified intelligence reports by Hillary Clinton in 2011 that has like details of the meetings of the Egyptian generals and what they were discussing. And General Hassan al-Ruwaini, who was back then the commander of the Central Zone, which is Cairo, was like pissing in his pants. And he was like telling, the other generals that, I cannot guarantee the loyalty of the troops if I give them the order to fire. That's why they had to move in quickly and depose Hosni Mubarak, or else the whole revolution would have destroyed the system that the generals were part of.
What do you think in Germany, how would a revolution look like? Because I think we have the striking, we have more and more strikes going on, and just in my opinion, I think lots of Germans think about a revolution like, yeah, maybe it's a beautiful idea, but it can get so violent and it's just so upsetting and hard to do, and we just don't want to risk what we have, because you already said it's still Germany, compared to so many other countries, has a lot of wealth, and we just don't want to risk it because it could fail completely. We could have a counter-revolution, and God knows what happens next. So people kind of try to stick to it, to not risk too much, and maybe go for some strikes, demonstrations.
You are totally right. And my argument is that up until the very last moment, people would be clinging to the hope of reforms. No one wants a revolution, even me. I don't. Who wants, to brave bullets in the streets and and confront tanks and organize organize all of these protests, and then protests might fail, so you have to organize them again and do it. No one wants this. If some angel comes from the sky now and tells me, I'll solve all your problems with just one click, I would be happy for it. But my argument is that people get pushed to the corner at some point. And these points are actually exceptional in nations' lives. Again, people tell you, oh, the West, never sees any revolutions. It's the Middle East and the global South, where repression and tyranny, they are used to revolutions. That's bullshit. The 2011 revolution, when was the last time we had a revolution before 2011 in Egypt? 1919. So revolutions anywhere is a very exceptional moment in the history of the nation. And people all the time, they are under the illusion and hoping to get reforms. And maybe, the economic situation deteriorates. So Yanis comes in and tells them, oh, elect me, and I will, stop this neoliberal package and I will raise your living standards, blah, blah, blah. So actually people would elect you, and they will give you a try. And of course you will fail because it's about the system, not about, the people that you put on top of that system. So Hannes will come in and, he will say, oh, Yanis, sucks, give me a try and I will blah, 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 fix it. People will elect him. They might go back and elect you, again, and they will stay in this until they reach some limit where they are like, I guess we will have to depend on ourselves to bring about this change. Now, this process of radicalization, will be faster and will be easier if Hossam, Yanis, and Hannes and the other revolutionaries are organized enough even in a nucleus core. Some people always make fun of revolutionary organizations as, it's a minority. Well, of course it's a minority. If they were the majority, a revolution would have happened a long time ago.
Yeah, makes sense.
But everyone, is hoping for reform. But what we can do at least is that at the time when this disillusion with the system completely happens, is that we would be a substantial minority. If we take the example once again of German society, when did the Nazis start to have support, like substantial support? It was after the Great Depression. The first time that they ran for elections, they didn't get, any votes. I can't now remember, it was a very trivial percentage. But after Great Depression, when it happened, people, their common sense shatters. They start looking for more radical alternatives. So they were either voting for the communists or the fascists. And actually, I don't want to tell you, German history, you know it better than me, but by 1933, if like the socialists and the communists would have united, they would have been like in a much bigger majority faction than the Nazis. So the next time the crisis hits, if you and I are not organized enough, people will go to the AfD. People will go to the far right, who will be telling them it's because Hossam and the people of color, who have brought this catastrophe to our country. It's Yanis and Hannes, those left-wing, troublemakers,
Left-wing.
who are like destroying our system and trying to stab us, in the back.
Yeah, but in Egypt you were organized and you still failed. So
Yeah, because we were not organized enough.
okay.
Here's the thing, like I, as Hossam, I was part of the revolutionary socialist movement. My organization was the biggest in the radical left. But at the same time, on the eve of the revolution, we were hundreds only. We were dozens of cadres surrounded by hundreds of members. Now, we might have had influential organizers. Like, for example, the strike leadership in Mahalla included some of our comrades. Those who were involved in the independent union struggles, included some of our comrades. So we were influential in the political scene, but we were still small. We were not big enough to take on this task. Who were the big organizations at the time? It was the Muslim Brotherhood. It was some other liberal organizations. But we as revolutionary leftists, we should have been bigger in order to make this revolution successful.
Yes, but don't you think that's exactly the point, Hossam? Because you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. If you look at all the, for example, Arab countries, even in our political class, sometimes people say that, Islam is not compatible with democracy, they cannot be changed. And we see it, like, even now in Tunisia, I think, every revolution failed, in Iran as well. Do you think that has something to do with Islam and the people there? Is it their mindset?
Well, you have to differentiate between two things. The political Islam if you want to talk about Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, the Jihadis, and what have you. And you have to talk about the mainstream Islam as a religion for the population. Now, when it comes to mainstream Islam, for the population, I think this is a racist and colonialist point of view that tries to picture Muslim majority nations as those who are still living in the medieval ages, blah, blah, blah. And this was the kind of rhetoric that the Western imperial powers used when they came to colonize us. It was the white man's burden. This was the coined, actually, slogan that the imperialists had raised at the time. So no, Muslims, just like Christians, just like atheists, just like anyone else, they are still human beings and they have needs. And at some point, they will get pushed to the corner. So they have to fight back. Now, when they start fighting back, they start challenging many of the reactionary ideas that they have in their heads. I can give you some concrete example. The situation of women in Egypt is bad. This is not a secret. And, they are second or third class citizens. But in the strike wave that preceded 2011, in most of the factories that I have entered, where there was substantial women presence, women were leading the industrial action. This is one thing. The second thing is that even the whole industrial strike wave, it started by 3,000 female garment workers in Mahalla, which is the largest textile mill in the Middle East. And they started the strike and they went touring the factory compound chanting, "Where are the men? Here we are the women," which is a football chant that they have modified. So, women started it, women were leading it. And, guess what? These were women in veil, and the other guys were mostly Muslims. In any sector that had substantial Coptic presence, Coptic are the Orthodox Christians that we have in Egypt. Egypt is a sectarian country, and there is institutionalized and societal discrimination against the minority Christians that we have. But in sectors that had substantial Coptic presence, like, for example, the railways, like the tax collectors, who went on strike in Egypt, they actually, Copts were elected among the strike leadership. So in the same way that you saw in Russia, which was very anti-Semitic, when the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out, that the Russian workers were electing Jews, to lead them. And this actually gave way to the Nazi counter-propaganda that it's Jewish Bolshevism. Why did they say that? Because, half of the leadership, were Jews in the country that invented the pogroms at the end of the day. So revolutions, they change the mentality of the people. Now, the last point that I will make when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood in specific, this is like the Islamic version of the Christian Democrats that you have here in Germany, with minor differences, to be honest. They are a reformist organization that opted for the Islamization of society, but via taking part in parliamentary elections, taking part in professional syndicate elections. I'm not saying that, to defend them or to think that, they provided an alternative. But at the end of the day, they reached the presidency via the ballot box. People elected them. And who ousted them? It was a military coup. Military coup that allied itself with the secular opposition. So we have to be a little bit more careful when it comes to these sweeping categorizations, whether it comes to Muslims or Islamists. The last point that I will highlight in this, that even the Muslim Brotherhood, class dynamics apply to them. It's a multi-class organization. The leadership might enjoy the support and the backing of some rich industrialists and some rich landowners, conservative landowners. The bulk of the organization, is composed of middle-class professionals. In the bottom, they do have some support among the working class and the farmers. Now, what does this mean? This means that at every twist and turn, the leadership could not take a concrete position that would satisfy all the classes in the organization. So they either used to stay silent or come up with very vague and general slogans like Islam is the solution. Okay, well, Islam is the solution. What is Islam gonna do when it comes to labor rights? So if you had attended any of the mass mobilizations, for example, by the Muslim Brotherhood that were calling for Sharia, what is Sharia? If you ask someone like Khairat Shater, who's a billionaire and he was like in the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood and right now he's in prison, maybe Sharia for him would be giving workers a fair wage. Privatization, we're not against it, but we're against corrupt privatization. We should have anti-union laws because unions disrupt, for example, production, this and that. But if you had asked one of the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood in these protests, what is Sharia for you? He would tell you, Sharia is job security. Sharia is that I would get justice. Sharia is that my right to have a labor union. Sharia is that me and my sons would not be thrown out in the streets for lack of housing. So as you can see...
Really flexible term then.
So we should work with the Muslim Brotherhood then?
Actually, I did work with the Muslim Brotherhood. There are occasions that you will find yourself, in the same trench as the Muslim Brotherhood. But here is the thing, I can work with the devil. But as long as I maintain my independent organization and my independent slogans and my independent propaganda and agitation, meaning that I can organize an anti-war protest with the Muslim Brotherhood. And this happened a lot, before 2011, because they are against the war in Iraq.
Including the women.
Including the women. They had also, women. By the way, they do have support among the women, also activists.
Because it's a really male name, Brotherhood.
Yeah, they do have inside also sections like Muslim sisterhood,
Okay.
So, but I don't want to get into a game of semantics. It's definitely a male, patriarchal organization. At the end of the day, I'm not going to dispute that. But I talk about a concrete example. We support the Palestinians, and the Muslim Brotherhood also supports the Palestinians, and it's against U.S. imperialism and against Zionism. If we show up for a protest, you will find some Muslim Brotherhood, activists definitely chanting against the Jews. If I'm working with them, does this mean that, I will join their chant, against the Jews? No, I have a clear view regarding the Palestinian cause that, our fight is with Zionism as a political ideology, but I don't have issue with the Jews. So we would not repeat these slogans, for example, and then we would try to drown them with our slogans. That's again Zionism. When we distribute leaflets in that protest, we will not distribute leaflets that toes their ideological line. It will be leaflets that explains the Marxist view regarding the Palestinian cause, for example. So if we are against the war in Iraq and we both show up for a protest, they might, chant against the crusading West. You will find, people chant, the Crusaders and the West. We would be chanting against Western imperialism and actually telling them it's not a war on Islam. This is war for oil. Now, they might raise slogans, that, Islam is this, Islam is that, but, there are really, deeper roots behind this, other than us being Muslims, and these are, white crusaders who are coming in. So, you can organize, with them, and actually, you are looking for winning their base, because this is your audience. They should not have gone to the Muslim Brotherhood. But it's because you were not good enough. You were not a good organizer. The left had catastrophic history for this and that. It's a long story, that you lost your base to them. So are you dealing with a fascist organization? No, it's not a fascist organization. But it's not a progressive organization either. But remember, fascists, you don't argue with fascists. You punch a fascist in the face. You confront a fascist in the street. But with the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, you argue with them, against them, and against their ideas, so as to win them over. And during this year, where Morsi was president, we had Muslim Brotherhood strike leaders victimized because of his neoliberal policies. Now, when they were victimized, they came to the socialist labor lawyers to defend them. And we started to have conversations with them. They started reading our publications. So if you dealt with them as fascists, then this means that they are the enemy.
Yeah.
But they are not. So finally, our slogan is, we are sometimes with the Islamists, but never with the state.
Okay. Just to come to an end and to talk about the current situation in Egypt, one aspect I found really interesting is the role of the Palestinian cause. And I read a lot about Iran and the protests, and there for me it seems also to be one of the trigger points, but for a different reason. Like, I don't know if it's in solidarity or not in solidarity with the Palestinians, but the Iranians are protesting towards their government to get out of Palestine or stop collaborating with Hezbollah and stuff like that. So it's a different counter approach kind of to the Egyptian approach.
Definitely, I would prefer if an Iranian activist would answer this question, but I will tell you from what I heard from other Iranian activists here in Berlin. They tell me that definitely there is a stream among the protesters in Iran who are calling for whatever you've mentioned now, that cut support, to Gaza, we cut support to Hezbollah, do this and do that. Definitely. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that Lenin says revolution is the festival of the oppressed. You're in Berlin, the capital of all festivals. You know what happens in festivals. You find people who are drunk, you find people who are stoned, you find people who are like tripping with acid, you find people who are like stage diving, you find people who are dancing, you find people like making love, under some tree. Like there is all sorts of things that happen in a festival. The same goes in Iran. You will find those who are like, against the Iranian support for the Palestinian resistance. You'll find those who are for the Iranian support for the Palestinian resistance, but they are against, their domestic policy. You'll find all sorts of ideas. Now, because it is a dictatorial regime that tries to control the flow of information, we don't have like the full, complete picture. And while we live here in the West, we are dependent on the BBC and, we're dependent on the other Western outlets who would definitely love to focus on this thing, who would like to focus on, if there is like one graffiti, the whole like Iranian population are against this. But from what I heard from the Iranian activists here is that it's not the dominant stream. That there are those who are pissed off with the support, and there are others who say that we are pro-Palestinian, but we are against our mullahs. We don't want them to continue ruling us. And by the way, also in Egypt, it's not like 100% of the Egyptians are pro-Palestinian. You will find those who tell you like it's none of our business, we should just like focus on Egypt. Why do you bring in Israel or like Palestine and the conflict into this? We should only like mind our own business. These ideas are also present everywhere. But I will conclude by this is that people are not static. People are not static, constant beings. Think of yourself like, 10 years before, or think of yourself 5 years before. Think of yourself even like 5 days, ago. People change their ideas all the time. So as long as they are not fascists, a fascist, I cannot argue with a fascist. As long as they are not fascists, then this means that you can win them over. They might have regressive ideas today, but they will get pushed to the corner and they have to fight, and they might start challenging those reactionary ideas in their head. I always like to focus on the hopeful side of things, even in the midst of a very, very dark scene. And there is this saying, the darker the night, the brighter the star. So let's cling to that star in the midst of this darkness.
I would conclude with the current situation now in Egypt, because maybe that's a good way to connect all of what you've said, because for me now it's really, really hard to see this glimpse of hope now in Egypt, because when you see the news, Sisi is doing this, that, new arrests. At the same time, always happening again some attacks on Coptic churches, and every aspect looks to me at least really, really frustrating. Where would you see hope?
The regime that evolved after the 2013 military coup is a war regime, but it's not like a foreign war regime, it's a war on the population regime. Even the ruling class that we have now, it's different from the ruling class before 2011, by the way. The ruling class is composed of military generals now. Like, it's militarized form of capitalism. This meant that lethal and carceral violence is the first response of the regime towards any potential source of dissent.
And that makes it more powerful?
It definitely makes them more fearful. It definitely makes them more powerful. They have killed thousands of Egyptians, probably up on roughly like 5,000 after the military coup. They have destroyed most of the independent trade unions. They have destroyed most of the political parties, if not all of them, all the community organizations. But it is a toxic formula that will eventually lead to their demise, in my view. And this is what makes me hopeful. Why? Under Mubarak, even when he was a dictator, he presided over a vibrant civil society. And civil society here, I mean it in the Gramscian sense, because sometimes today when you say civil society, people talk of NGOs.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
Yeah, but civil society in the Gramscian definition are all of those institutions that act as a buffer between society and the state. So it will include political parties, it will include trade unions, it will include the parliament, it will include all of these other institutions. Now, under Hosni Mubarak, there was a vibrant civil society. So while the state, of course, was heavy-handed, police used to torture, blah, 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 and all of these abuses, he still depended on this civil society to manage dissent. So let's say that if shit happens in Palestine, then he can give the green light to the Muslim Brotherhood to mobilize protests that will be contained on campuses. They will not chant against Mubarak. It had, an agreed upon ceiling. If an economic crisis happens, then he had a huge network of Salafis that they can mobilize over the Danish cartoons that are against Islam, or they can fabricate something against Christians and blah, 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 as to divert the attention of the people. If strikes break out, then there was legal left-wing organization called the Tagammu and some trade unions that he can reach out to so as to diffuse the industrial actions in the workplace. But what Sisi did after 2013 is that he completely smashed the civil society. Completely smashed it. We have a rubber stamp parliament now, but everyone knows it's a joke. The Muslim Brotherhood organizations and all of the dissident organizations have been destroyed, killed, or imprisoned. So this means when an explosion happens, it will be the explosion directly vis-a-vis the state. There won't be any other buffers to diffuse it. Now, the security services might be fearful. The security services might be brutal. But again, this army that Sisi depends upon to police the population, it's based off conscripts. These conscripts, when the shit hits the fan, will they open fire on a mass population, especially that the economic situation is going bad for everyone now? I don't think so. So we have to look at these things as a potential. Right now there is an economic crisis in Egypt, and there is devaluation packages that are happening for the Egyptian pound. And Sisi is not as confident as he was a few years ago. Part of this high level of repression stemmed from the fact that he had a firm grip on the state and firm grip on the security services. But we have learned across history that when a society goes into a catastrophe, the gods up there, they start quarreling. because there are divisions. Should we go left? Should we go right? Should we make reforms? Or no, we should fight back. So among this confusion, it leaves, for the commoners like you and I, a space that we can start mobilizing.
Yeah.
And I can see that this is happening gradually and incrementally.
Okay, so I talked about with Hannes about Egypt, and I was there also for a short trip. But you don't see that much military, and I'm not sure, is it even safe to go to Egypt? Because there's so much going on sometimes, or would you recommend it if you want to learn more about the situation, or is it difficult for a tourist to see anything on what's really going on?
The military is now not deployed in the public spaces in Egypt. It's mainly the militarized police that we have, that you will find everywhere. Now, you as a tourist, you will probably end up going to the Red Sea resorts. That's where most Germans go there to do diving. I don't think you will really catch a glimpse of what's happening in Egypt. And if you are in Egypt, if you visit, the tourist attractions, which, is legitimate, if I'm a tourist anywhere, I would go to the tourist attractions. But funnily enough, many of the tourist bloggers who have come to Egypt and with, the sincere intention of polishing up, the picture of the country and sharing, their exciting adventures with their followers, they ended up being arrested because who's this guy going around with a camera? Oh, arrest him, Yeah. And there are several actually, Western bloggers who came up with don't go to Egypt because of this. There are so many ways that you can end up in police custody in Egypt, even if you're not a dissident. So I'm not...
I actually remember a documentary about a guy doing a bike journey from South Africa to Europe, and he was, of course, arrested in Egypt.
Yeah, of course. Who's this, guy on a bike and who's, taking photos and videos around, the first instantaneous reaction is arrest him, you know? So in that way, you might know what is it like, to be in Egypt. I'm not here trying to say go or don't go. It's up to you, but at least try to educate yourself about the situation before going.
And how is it for you? There's no chance to go back?
I'm wanted because of my role in the revolution and because of my role in storming the state security police offices.
Oh, okay.
And doxing their police officers in March 2011. So, in my case, I'm wanted by name for them, so I can't go back.
But in Germany, you feel safe? There are no Egyptian agents or whatever?
A few years ago, there was an Egyptian spy arrested who turned out to be spying on Merkel.
Deshalb wiederhole ich nochmal, ausspähen unter Freunden, das geht gar nicht.
Passing information to the Egyptian embassy on Egyptian dissidents here. I don't want to sound too paranoid. I don't think that they are sending people after me, here. I wish if I was that important. I think that they have other things to worry about now, more urgent than me. But definitely our political activist events here are being monitored by the embassy. And there is always the danger of us targeting our families back home. This is always something that we have to put into consideration.
Has that already happened to you?
It happened,
okay.
Yeah. On a couple of occasions. I don't want to go into the details now, but definitely that's it happened.
From what you've said, I figure you're slightly optimistic looking towards the future of Egypt now, and it's changing
I'm
now
always
gradually?
optimistic. I'm always optimistic because as activists we have to be optimistic. We don't have the luxury to be.
But you also have reasons to be optimistic.
There are definitely reasons, but even before the crisis hit and when the regime was completely solid, I used to say that do not inflate your expectations about Sisi's demise anytime soon. It will take us a long time to bring this guy down, but it will happen. And we just have to be realistic about our assessment of the situation. Because sometimes people have this caricaturish view of an optimist revolutionary that, you would call for a revolution 24/7 while, the objective conditions are not there.
Yeah.
And this, of course, is stupid. So, you are at a time when you probably have to come up with initiatives for reforms with low ceiling that does not raise the slogan down with military rule that we used to chant a few years ago. But, in the same way that 2011 happened after an entire decade of struggles, half of this decade, no one dared to open their mouths about Mubarak. And the fight was over few things here and there, but then it escalated. We have to get inspired by that experience. That maybe, we cannot bring down Sisi now, but there are small fights happening here and there, and things will evolve, especially that the regime is not as solid as it used to be.
So it would make sense for maybe scholars or students to remember or to continue the research about the uprisings in Egypt and to learn from them for the future. Definitely.
We, meaning me, you, and Hannes, we are part of the same group, of people. I'm an internationalist. I don't believe in the nation state. I don't believe in boundaries. I believe that we are essentially human beings at the end of the day. So a defeat for us in Egypt will be a defeat for you here in Germany. In the same way that a victory for us in Egypt will be a victory for you here in Germany. This means that you have to study the Egyptian revolution because it is part of your own history. In the same way that when I was in Egypt, I studied the 1918 revolution in Germany because this is the tradition I belong to. This is my own history. It's not the history of some foreign people. These are my people at the end of the day. So yes, you should study the Egyptian revolution, you should study the Tunisian revolution, you should study what happened in Syria, you should study what happened in Iran, you should study what happened in Spain 1936, you should study what happened in Hungary in 1956, you should study what happened in Russia in 1905, 1917. This is the memory of our class that we belong to.
Okay.
Inspiring perspective for international history.
Yes. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
It was very interesting.
Thanks a lot. And I want to thank you actually for giving me the platform to raise awareness about the Egyptian cause. And I hope this is not going to be the last time that we have this chat.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Millions of Egyptians came down to the streets in nationwide protests.
This uprising defies any definitions.
People are gathering in the largest demonstrations against President Hosni Mubarak.
قرار السيد الرئيس محمد حسني مبارك بالتخلي عن منصب رئيس الجمهورية.
Listen to the chants roaring in downtown Cairo, the hundreds of people walking to the streets. It's unprecedented.
The people we've seen taken to the streets today are not the 50, 60 activists that we've been seen protesting in Egypt for the past 5-6 years. These were normal Egyptians.
They shot at us. Am I an enemy of the state? I came here to ask just for rights.
The protesters have lost their fear. They are determined to continue doing this. It doesn't show any signs of stopping.
We did all of this in order just to remove him and put someone exactly like him in his place.
لأن هي طبعا حكايتنا ما حدش بيحكيها غيرنا احنا.
We are breaking into programming here on Al Jazeera, 11:45 GMT, about 1:45 in the afternoon in Cairo, Egypt. Live continuing coverage here on Al Jazeera of a day of mass protest. They called it a day of rage. It is fast turning into that.
The unbelievable pictures you're seeing there of crowds of protesters trying to dump the vehicle That is a personnel carrier that carries troops of the police. They're trying almost to knock it over the
into
side
the river,
of the bridge into the Nile. Yes, into the Nile. You can see more tear gas being fired at the protesters, and more of them are coming our way.
Take your
Just
time.
1 second, stay with us, come on. Ahmed, بدل.
The atmosphere in the square is absolutely electric. People have come in their tens of thousands. There is quite literally standing room only. There's a real sense here that history will be made tonight.
We've lost a lot of people, and we've lost them for a cause. The cause is that we wanted Mubarak to be out. We owe it to them to stick it till the end. They are shooting. There are people, there are some of the thugs with rifles on the bridge, and they shot at our demonstrators, like the latest of our dead protesters. He was shot right through the head. I had two friends watching this happen. We are not leaving this place till Mubarak leaves.
For the journalists who were witnessing it, what you were seeing was a brutality that completely disrupted what had been a very peaceful protest.